Welcome to the Daily Brain Podcast. Words are the building blocks of thought.
That's right.
Each day we'll introduce a new one to empower your conversations and sharpen your understanding of the world. Like and subscribe to keep growing your word power daily. Today's word is democracy. Okay, so imagine you're back in 8th grade civics class.
Okay.
But this time, it's way more interesting. We're going on a deep dive into democracy, a word that's thrown around a lot, but often misunderstood.
Yeah, definitely.
You've got a stack of sources to help us break it down. Merriam-Webster, some YouTube videos, a handout from USCIS, the works.
That's great. It's a word that's loaded with history and meaning and even controversy. But before we get into the complexities, let's start with the basics, just like we would if we were explaining it to an 8th grader.
Perfect. So where does this powerful word even come from?
Well, democracy traces its roots back to ancient Greece. It's a combination of two Greek words, demos, meaning people, and kratos, meaning rule.
Okay.
So in its simplest form, democracy means rule by the people.
Rule by the people. It sounds straightforward, but I have a feeling it's anything but simple in practice. What does rule by the people actually look like?
That's where things get interesting. Our good friend Merriam-Webster defines democracy as government by the people and points out that there are two main ways this can play out: representative democracy and direct democracy.
Okay, let's break those down. Representative democracy, that sounds familiar. Is that what we have here in the United States?
You got it. In a representative democracy, citizens elect representatives to make decisions on their behalf. Think of it like choosing a class president to speak for the whole class.
So instead of everyone voting on every single issue, we choose people to represent our interests and make decisions for us. Makes sense. But what about this direct democracy thing? That sounds a bit more chaotic.
It can be. Direct democracy is where citizens vote directly on laws and policies themselves. It's the kind of system they had in ancient Athens, where every citizen could participate in the decision-making process.
Wow, so no Congress or president, just everyone getting together to hash things out? I can see how that could get messy.
It definitely has its pros and cons. One of the sources, We the Veterans, points out that while the U.S. primarily operates as a representative democracy, we do have elements of direct democracy at the state and local levels.
Interesting. What kind of things would people vote on directly at the local level?
Think of things like school budgets, local ordinances, or even ballot initiatives where citizens propose and vote on specific laws. It's a way for people to have a more direct say in matters that affect their communities.
That makes sense. It's like a hybrid system, a mix of representative and direct democracy. But now I'm curious about this whole democracy versus republic debate that always pops up. Is the U.S. a democracy or a republic?
That's a question that often trips people up. Technically, the U.S. is a constitutional republic, meaning that we have a constitution that lays out the framework for our government and protects individual rights. But we also function as a representative democracy because citizens elect representatives at both the federal and state levels.
So it's not an either situation.
Right.
It's more like we've blended the principles of both a republic and a democracy. We have a constitution that guides us, but we also have democratic elections where citizens choose their leaders.
Exactly. It's like having the best of both worlds. And one of the YouTube videos, Illustrate to Educate, actually refers to the U.S. system as a blended representational democracy, which I think captures it pretty well.
Okay, that clears things up a bit. Now, we keep hearing about the Constitution in the context of democracy. What's the connection there?
The Constitution is like the rule book for our democracy. It's the supreme law of the land, as the We the Veterans source puts it. And it's designed to protect the principles of democracy by limiting the power of the government and safeguarding individual rights.
Right, and that's where the Supreme Court comes in, acting as the referee to make sure all the laws and actions of the government are in line with the Constitution.
Precisely. The Supreme Court plays a crucial role in interpreting the Constitution and ensuring that it remains relevant and adaptable to the challenges of our time. A great example is the landmark Brown v. Board of Education case, where the Supreme Court declared racial segregation in public schools unconstitutional.
That was a pivotal moment in our history.
Yes.
And it shows how the Constitution can be a powerful tool for social progress, and ensuring equality for all citizens.
It certainly does. And that's a good reminder that democracy is not just about voting or having a constitution. It's about ensuring that everyone has equal rights and opportunities to participate in society.
So true. Now, I know there are a lot of misconceptions floating around about democracy, especially here in the U.S. Can we tackle some of those before we wrap up this first part of our deep dive?
Absolutely. Let's dive into the world of democracy myths and see if we can separate fact from fiction.
Sounds good to me. Let's do it. Okay, so we've covered the basics of democracy. We've traced its origins back to ancient Greece, looked at different ways it can be implemented like representative versus direct democracy, and even talked about how the U.S. system blends those ideas together under the guidance of our Constitution. But I'm thinking about something you mentioned earlier, about how the way we do democracy in the U.S. has evolved over time. I'm guessing things weren't always as straightforward as they seem today.
You're right. Things haven't always been so simple. The journey of American democracy has been full of twists, turns, and even some dead ends, and it's still evolving.
That's fascinating. It makes you realize that democracy isn't a static thing. It's a constantly evolving process. So what are some of the key milestones in that evolution? What moments shaped American democracy into what it is today?
Well, one really interesting example highlighted in the We the Veterans source is how U.S. senators were originally chosen, not by the people, but by state legislatures. It wasn't until 1913, with the ratification of the 17th Amendment, that we shifted to the direct election of senators that we have today.
Wow, that's a huge change. So, for a big chunk of American history, the people didn't have a direct say in who represented them in the Senate. It makes you appreciate the power of those amendments to the Constitution and how they can really shift the balance of power in a democracy.
Absolutely. And that shift to direct election of senators was a major victory for those who believed in a more inclusive and participatory democracy. It's a reminder that even in a well-established democracy, there's always room for improvement and expansion of voting rights.
Speaking of different ways to do democracy, the Illustrate to Educate video touched on this concept of mobocracy in ancient Athens. It kind of makes democracy sound like a scary thing. Can you explain what they meant by that?
Mobocracy definitely paints a less than ideal picture of democracy, but it highlights a potential pitfall that any democratic system has to be aware of. Remember, in ancient Athens, citizens voted on pretty much everything directly. There weren't elected representatives like we have today.
Right, so everyone got together in those big assemblies to debate and make decisions. Well, that sounds pretty cool in theory. I can see how it could easily go off the rails.
Exactly. If the majority always gets its way, without any safeguards in place, then the rights of the minority can be trampled on. That's what mobocracy refers to, a situation where the majority essentially bullies the minority, even if their demands are unjust or harmful.
Okay, I get it now. It's like if in that classroom we were talking about earlier, the majority decided that only kids with brown hair get to go on the field trip. That wouldn't be fair at all. It seems like finding that balance between majority rule and minority rights is a key challenge for any democracy.
Absolutely. And different democratic systems approach that challenge in different ways. The U.S. system, for example, tries to prevent mobocracy through things like the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and an independent judiciary. These act as checks and balances to ensure that even if the majority wants something, it can't violate the fundamental rights of individuals or minority groups.
That makes me think about all the different forms that democracy takes around the world. We've been focusing a lot on the U.S. model, but I'm guessing there's no one-size-fits-all approach to democracy.
You're absolutely right. Democracy is a versatile concept that has been adapted and implemented in countless ways across the globe. It's like a recipe with core ingredients, but you can add different spices and flavors to create unique dishes.
I like that analogy. So what are some of those different flavors of democracy we see in the world today?
Well, for starters, you have parliamentary democracies, like the United Kingdom or Canada, where the executive branch, the prime minister and their cabinet, are actually members of the legislative branch, the parliament. It's a different way of organizing power and ensuring accountability compared to the U.S. system, where we have a separation of powers between the branches.
So in a parliamentary system, the prime minister isn't elected directly by the people, but is chosen by the parliament.
Exactly. It's a system where the majority party in parliament selects the prime minister. And if the parliament loses confidence in the prime minister, they can vote them out, even before their term is up. It's a way to make the executive branch more directly accountable to the legislature.
That's fascinating. Makes you think about the trade-offs involved in different systems. What other kinds of democracies are out there?
Well, another interesting model is Switzerland, which incorporates elements of direct democracy on a national level. Swiss citizens regularly vote on referendums, which allow them to directly approve or reject laws and policies proposed by the government.
So they have a system where people can directly weigh in on major national decisions. That's pretty empowering.
It is. And it's a system that works well in Switzerland, but it might not be suitable for every country. It's a reminder that the best form of democracy for a particular society depends on its history, culture, and the needs of its people.
This whole discussion about different types of democracies is making me realize that there's no single right answer when it comes to governing a country democratically. It seems like it's all about finding the right balance for each specific context.
That's a great insight. And that's why the ongoing conversation about democracy, what it means, how to achieve it, and how to safeguard it is so important. There's no finish line in this journey. It's about constantly learning, adapting, and striving for a more just and equitable society.
Well said. Now, before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, there's one question that's been swirling around in my mind. If democracy is truly about rule by the people, then how do we ensure that all the people are actually represented and have a voice?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And unfortunately, history teaches us that the ideal of rule by the people often clashes with the reality of power imbalances and systemic inequalities.
That's true. I'm thinking about the long struggles for voting rights in the U.S. women's suffrage, the civil rights movement, the fight for LGBTQ+ rights. These are all examples of groups that had to fight tooth and nail for their right to participate fully in our democracy.
Exactly. And even today, there are ongoing debates about voter suppression, gerrymandering, and campaign finance reform, all of which can impact who has access to the ballot box and whose voices get heard in the halls of power.
It's a reminder that democracy is not a destination, but a constant work in progress. We have to be vigilant about protecting and expanding voting rights, ensuring that everyone's voice is heard, and holding our leaders accountable to the principles of democracy.
Couldn't agree more. And that brings us to the crucial role of citizen participation in a democracy. It's not just about the systems and institutions, it's about people getting involved, making their voices heard, and shaping the future of their communities and their country.
That's a great point, and that leads us perfectly into the final part of our deep dive, where we'll explore what active citizenship looks like and why it's so crucial to the health and vitality of any democracy. But before we jump into that, we'd love to hear from you, our listeners. What are your thoughts on this whole idea of democracy and its various forms? What resonates with you? What questions are bubbling up in your mind? Share your insights and join the conversation on social media using #TheDailyBrain. We'll be right back after a short break. Welcome back to the Daily Brain podcast for the final part of our deep dive into democracy. We've covered a lot of ground, from its origins in ancient Greece to its many forms around the world, and even debunked some common myths about democracy in the U.S.
We've certainly taken our listeners on a journey through the history and nuances of this complex concept.
We have. But I think the most important part of this conversation is figuring out what democracy means for us as individuals. It's not just a word in a textbook or a system of government. It's something we live and breathe every day.
That's right. Democracy is a lived experience, a set of values, and a way of life. And perhaps most importantly, it requires active participation from each and every one of us.
So true. We touched on this earlier, but let's dive a bit deeper. What does active participation in a democracy actually look like? Is it just about voting in elections?
Voting is definitely a fundamental part of participating in a democracy, but it's just the first step. Think of it as buying a ticket to the show, but the real experience happens when you engage with the performance.
I like that analogy. So what are some ways we can engage with the performance of democracy beyond just casting a ballot?
Well, for starters, it's about staying informed about the issues that affect our communities and our country. That means reading news from a variety of sources, listening to different perspectives, and engaging in thoughtful discussions with people who might hold different views.
It's about being critical thinkers, questioning assumptions, and forming our own opinions based on evidence and reason, not just what we hear on social media or from talking heads on TV.
Exactly. Democracy thrives on a diversity of perspectives and a willingness to engage in civil discourse. It's not about shouting down those who disagree with us, but rather trying to understand where they're coming from and finding common ground.
It's about recognizing that we don't have all the answers and that we can learn from listening to others, even if we don't always agree with them.
That's such a crucial point. And active participation also means holding our elected officials accountable. It's about contacting our representatives, attending town hall meetings, and speaking up about the issues that matter to us.
It's about letting our elected officials know what we think, what we care about, and what we expect from them.
Right, and it's not just about complaining. It's also about showing appreciation when they do something we agree with, or offering constructive suggestions for how they can better represent our interests.
And let's not forget about the power of getting involved in our communities, volunteering our time and energy to causes we believe in, and working together to create positive change at the grassroots level.
Absolutely. Democracy isn't just about what happens in Washington, D.C. or in state capitals. It's about what we do in our own neighborhoods, schools, and workplaces to make our communities stronger and more just.
It's about recognizing that we all have a role to play in shaping the future of our democracy, and that our collective actions, big or small, can make a real difference.
I love that. And it reminds me of that powerful quote by Margaret Mead. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has.
That's such an inspiring quote. It makes you realize that we don't have to wait for someone else to fix things, or for permission to make a difference. We can each take ownership of our role as citizens and work together to create a better world.
And that brings us back to the USCIS handout, which highlighted the rights and responsibilities of U.S. citizens. It's a good reminder that with rights come responsibilities.
Absolutely. The handout specifically mentions voting and contacting elected officials, but it also emphasizes other responsibilities, like obeying the law, serving on juries, and being informed about civic issues.
It's about understanding that democracy is not a spectator sport. It requires active engagement, a willingness to contribute to the common good, and a commitment to upholding the values and principles that underpin a free and just society.
Well said. As we wrap up this deep dive into democracy, I'm left with a sense of both hope and urgency. Hope, because we've seen throughout history how ordinary people have come together to fight for and achieve remarkable progress towards a more democratic world.
But also urgency, because democracy is fragile. It requires constant nurturing, vigilance, and a willingness to challenge the status quo when it fails to live up to its ideals.
Exactly. We can't afford to be complacent or take our freedoms for granted. So a final thought for our listeners. How will you contribute to the ongoing conversation about democracy? How will you exercise your rights and fulfill your responsibilities as a citizen?
We encourage you to reflect on these questions and find ways to make your voice heard and your actions count, because the future of democracy depends on each and every one of us.
Thank you for joining us on this journey of exploration. And remember, words are powerful tools for understanding and shaping our world. Keep learning, keep questioning, and keep engaging in the vital conversation about democracy.
Until next time, this is the Daily Brain Podcast signing off.